two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Cornell meteorologist emeritus Mark Wysocki. Today we're going to talk about flooding, largely in Ithaca, but also in other nearby towns. My interest in these questions comes mostly from my concern about the cost of housing here. A few months ago, there was consternation in city government because FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, came out with new maps that predicted so-called 100-year floods were likely to affect not just areas near the lake and along the creeks, but most of the flats. Hence, many property owners were going to have to be required to buy flood insurance. There is a national flood insurance program, and it is estimated to add an average $153 per month to housing costs. Of course, actual costs could be much more or less, depending on the value of the unit in question. And I thank the Ithaca Voice for noting that average number, $153 per month. And of course, I mentioned homeowners, property owners, but of course, when people rent, such costs get passed right on in their rents. The city had been making its plans based on a different set of maps, those issued by USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, which also predicted 100-year floods, but not quite as extensive and not in exactly the same areas. So, Professor Wysocki, could you comment on which set of maps is likely to be more accurate in its predictions?
Okay, I think the main thing we have to understand is how the difference between FEMA and the USGA and how these maps are actually prepared. So there's a big difference. FEMA uses historical trends. And what I mean by that is they just take a look at the last 100 years, if they have that kind of data. They plot up their points and they just connect them with a line. And then for the future, they just extend that line, given whatever trend they happen to see. With the USGA, however, what they do in their predictions is that they include new climate models as well as information about sea level rise and temperatures of the atmosphere. So what they're looking at is a more realistic approach to trying to predict changes in precipitation into the future by using the climate models, by using data from the coast. The USGA takes care of that, as well as the global temperatures. So the difference is FEMA uses more of a static approach. Whatever trend we see, that's the kind of trend we think is going to continue into the future. The USGA is a little more realistic because those trends can change over time. They may increase or they may decrease. The trends in your location could also shift. For what I mean by that is we're here in Ithaca, New York. So we see a certain trend of frequency once in a 100-year flood that might be 8 inches in 24 hours. However, that could change dramatically differently between FEMA and USGA in terms of their approach. And it may be that one may be producing a little bit less precipitation because the trend may be shifting. What I mean by that is these trends are not static. So what's happening in Ithaca in the future, that trend may have shifted northward or southward. And that's where climate models come in to help with the trying to pinpoint exactly where precipitation areas are changing and at what rate they are changing at. FEMA's maps will not have that information, and therefore they're what we consider to be static, assuming the same kind of rate of change. Again, I don't understand why the two do things differently. It's in terms of our viewpoint, it's a kind of an interesting experiment to kind of take a look at each. But then what we have to start doing is checking. That is, we have to run our computer models for USGA and see how well they've been predicting the flooding versus how well FEMA has been predicting the flooding. And that's what currently is being done. And as long as the funding is there, we'll be able to give you some idea then which one has been more or less realistically predicting what the future would be for flooding events.
I have to say, I'm quite surprised then, given that difference in methodology, that it is FEMA that comes out with predicting more flooding, more extensive flooding, because what we kind of hear on national news is more and more rain.
Yes. Now here comes the problem. You see, the USGA takes into consideration your topography where you live. It also takes into consideration with the climate models the changes in precipitation. So we have to be very careful. It may be that Ithaca in the future with the USGA is indicating that, yes, your rainfall will be slightly less, but maybe a neighboring community, such as Cooperstown, could be going up in precipitation. So that's where the USGA has an advantage of having a little more detail. I would caution, however, that when we flood, it doesn't have to be that the rain is falling in Ithaca. It could be falling in nearby communities, and because of the topography and how that water then tends to get into the rivers and the streams and the creeks, that then funnels down into the lakes, the Finger Lakes, and then they funnel down into either going northward to Lake Ontario, which is what most of Tompkins County drains towards. The southern end of Tompkins County drains southward down towards the Susquehanna. So it may be that what happens is local communities might be flooded out, but the rain won't be falling on you. It would be flooding from some other areas. And that's where both FEMA and USGA will have some difficulty in trying to predict exactly that. So you can imagine downtown Ithaca with all those rivers, creeks, streams feeding into Cayuga Lake. The lake then rises and it could flood out downtown Ithaca, even though it's not raining in Ithaca. It's the surrounding areas that would be the drainage.
Oh
And
yeah.
those are very complicated models to try and predict, especially now since we're changing our land use, which neither one of these predictors, FEMA or the USGA, really have in their model. How we change the use of our land, which changes how we flood, which is a great example in Pakistan. When they have the monsoons, they're flooding like crazy in areas that never flooded because they changed the topography. They put roads in, villages in that weren't supposed to be there. So now the drainage has changed and they're getting massive floods in areas that they normally would not have had in the past.
Yeah, impervious surfaces, I believe. In fact,
Uh, that's
this,
also changing the flow patterns of these
yeah,
rivers and streams and so forth. That also is a big, huge problem as we try to build more urbanized areas and so forth. So it's it's a big problem that does not get into the climate models or anybody else's thinking when they put together these flood maps.
in fact, the city now charges. homeowners for the amount of impervious surface that they have on their property.
Okay. And that's also like in my area where I live by the airport. We're kind of expanding, but we're actually in a floodplain, and we actually have basically a wetlands area. So what happens is some people, when they want to build, they will drain the wetlands and put in their module homes, whatever the case. But now all of a sudden, that's where the runoff water was supposed to go. Now it's not going there anymore, so it's going to find another path, and that could be into a neighborhood that never flooded before, or it could actually simply just want to drain down into Ithaca, and more goes into Cayuga Lake.
Yeah, and I remember some historic lake floods.
Yes.
Uh, once when a member of our organization, the treasurer, in fact, seemed to have disappeared, and I finally tracked him down to his graduate student office on campus. And well, he wasn't at all upset that I had done that. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I lived down by the lake. My home flooded. So I moved in with my girlfriend." So he wasn't getting meeting notices because in those days, they only went out by postal mail,
Right. Mm-hmm.
long before cell phones.
So you do bring up some good points here. And the issue is going to be how is that going to impact, as what you let off with, the cost? Not only the cost for all this, but are you going to be able to get flood insurance is the next thing. Some of these insurance companies aren't going to want to give you flood insurance, and the government's only going to go so far. And given our current political uh, kind of atmosphere we have, they may cancel altogether. So again, what do people do? Not only people, but people organizing into the local government and so forth, and the surrounding communities. It has to be a holistic approach. It can't just be Ithaca. It has to be Ithaca, surrounding counties, or surrounding communities, Tompkins County, and everybody else that's in this watershed of ours that's going to have to come up with a game plan of, okay, whether we follow FEMA or we follow the USGA, what are we going to do for the future to mitigate this flooding? Do we put up new dams? Do we put up new waterways for flooding? And that's something that's going to cost money. And then who gets charged for it?
Yeah. Um, and actually, since this station, well, since the radio station WRFI broadcasts not only to Ithaca, but also to Watkins Glen, Montour Falls, Odessa, Cayuta, Beaver Dams, Horseheads, Newfield, Brooktondale, Etna, Dryden, Freeville, and I'm not even mentioning all the places that are on hilltops.
Right.
Uh, would these other places also have received flood maps recently?
They should be able to. The interesting thing is that NOAA has put out a new flood map. It's called Atlas 15. Okay, Atlas ATLAS 15. It was stopped by the federal government, but the central, north central, central, and south central states, Texas up through the Dakotas, their senators got on board along with the Northeast senators and said, no, we need these flood maps. This is about a 3-year redoing of the statistics for flooding across the entire United States. This would also include the lower 48 as well as Alaska and Hawaii. And it's a very, very detailed, much smaller scale. So we could tell the difference between Ithaca and Trumansburg and Dryden. They did a very good study on this. It was money that was spent from the federal government for 3 years. The Trump administration said, no, we're going to can it. And we already had it done. So now they're in the works of publishing it and verifying it. And it should come out in 2026. And this new map then will be available on the internet free of charge. It's an interactive website. So you type in your address, and specifically it will go and find for that address the various types of probabilities of 500 year, 500,000 year events. It's a very detailed map, and it will tell you in terms of from 5 minutes to 10 minutes, 15-minute intervals. Like if it rained for 5 minutes, what's the maximum you could expect in a 20 or 100-year event? It's a very detailed map, and it's going to be very useful for city planners to have this information. It will be available, as I said, in 2026. And so we are working on these flooding maps, and it'll be great for the hydrologists in the area, for the weather service. It'll be great for meteorologists in general for their predictions. And also, as I said, for city and urban planners and all this kind of stuff, that people get together and say, okay, look, here are the hot spots. If, Dryden might flood more than Ithaca. So what do we put our emphasis on changing the floodplain or the flooding for Dryden? Egypt Creek is one of their biggest problems they have when they flood. So do we come in and dredge that creek so that it drains better? When it drains better, then we have to worry, does it drain better into some other community that's not prepared for it? So that's why I'm saying you got to get everybody together here, and you have to follow that water all the way until you want to get rid of it, which is either Lake Ontario or the Chesapeake Bay. Those are our big drain areas that we have here for central New York. Just the way the drainage works. So actually, most of Tompkins County, the water drains towards the north to Lake Ontario, but it's got to go through what? The Erie Canal, things like this. So if we open up and we don't want the Finger Lakes to flood, and we open up and we flood the Erie Canal, which will eventually drain into Lake Ontario, then what about the people who live along the Erie Canal? They get flooded. So do we anticipate that maybe what we should do is manage this, that we see a storm coming, and do we start draining the lake slowly so that we can drain into the Erie, and then we can go up to Lake Ontario through Oswego River and so forth, so that everything is done gradually, so when we do get this big amount of rain, we can kind of handle it, okay? So this is something that needs then for the state of New York to get together with all the county supervisors, and then to get together with all the urban planners and so forth. And we should have a big meeting and talk about exactly how we want to do this. And then, I hate to say it, it could add more bureaucracy because you're going to need an agency that's going to be able to do this. But we already have agencies. We have the DEC, and they have meteorologists. We have the National Weather Service, the federal. So we already have people in place. It's just to set up a communication for these types of events that are going to be occurring with this new data, so that we can specify which areas will be hit the hardest, or what's the chance of getting a 1 in a 50-year flood out of this tropical storm that's coming up along the East Coast. So that the key thing here is to think ahead of time, that is to be proactive, not reactive. And then in the meantime, what is the cost to the local areas for increasing the sewage treatment, the drainage, things like this? I mean, Ithaca is probably, in all due respects, in the wrong place. Let's face it. It's not at sea level, it's at lake level. So when those lakes flood, you can't pump water into the lake because it's going to come right back at you.
Yeah.
You're not going to pump the stuff up on the hills because it's going to just drain back down. So the problem is these communities have, over time, have a historical, location. They're not going to move cities, although they have been doing this in the Midwest for some of the small towns along the Mississippi that are constantly flooding. They have actually moved entire communities to the higher levels, but you may be talking about 50, 75 homes. In Maine right now, along the coast of Maine, because of sea level rise, they are now moving all of their coastal buildings, that is their coastal habitat, the homes, they're moving them about 100 to 200 yards further inland. So that's their big project to do.
Oh, wow.
And they can do that because they have the land, but it's going to cost money. So some
Sure.
of this gets from the states, some of it is federal, and some of it, I'm most likely sure, is is the homeowners themselves. But if you're not going to sell them insurance for flooding, then the homeowners lose the home and they have nothing. So let's move them inland, and then we won't have this kind of problem, at
Yeah.
least in the near future.
Oh, about the lake, by the way, when I worked in the city, I mean for the city government, I remember there was dickering with the people at Mudlock at the northern end of the lake and whether
Yes.
they were going to open the gates and let the water out of the lake again, but will that flood somebody else up there, up north there, or will they leave it backing up into the city of Ithaca?
Well, that's where the forecast comes in. And I think if we had a forecast that we were seeing some heavy rain coming our way, whether it be from the leftovers of a hurricane, whether it be a stalled system that we were forecasting for, that we could drain the lake slowly. And that would then ease the impact when we did get the rain event and so forth. But you have to have agreements then with all these communities that we're going to be doing this. And you have to have that communication at the same time. So I used to forecast for a company, a food company in Rochester that had the same problem. They had what they would call drainage pits, where they would put the water in and they would just let it evaporate and then clean out afterwards. But if they had a heavy rain event that would all flood in the local areas, they would have to open up their dam and dump all the raw sewage right into Lake Ontario and pay a fine for that. So there are other industries in central New York that are like that, that use water and have these evaporation pools that are also going to need to have this kind of information, because then there's the other issue of the pollution that will be involved with all of this.
Yes, and I can finally add one funny memory from this area that came back to me when I started thinking about, well, the town of Ithaca, mostly on higher ground around the city, so probably not so flood prone. But back in the early 90s, they had a flooding incident that was not caused by the weather at all. It was caused by beavers who dammed up a stream and uh, quite close the inlet, by the way, to the lake. Um, and the the rail crews, the track crews who were maintaining the tracks noticed that the dammed up water was undermining the rail bed. Well, they dismantled the beaver dam. That night, the beavers came back, rebuilt it. And a day or so later, a train came through. The track gave way. The train derailed. The engine overturned. Quite a bit of diesel fuel went into the creek. That was the main damage. The engineer was not injured in any serious way. Um, the biggest victims of it were the beavers because the rail crews shot them. But that's just to say that not all flooding is caused by weather.
No, it can be
And
caused by nature, it can be caused by humans.
yeah,
Well,
and
we're part of nature.
yeah, and again, I think we have come to our end. Thank you, Professor Wysocki, for another interesting program.
My pleasure.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.